Buenos dias. Hopefully you've already filled in your vocab page with the school subjects. And now we're going to talk a little bit about how to read a schedule in Spanish and talk about at what time something happens. You remember that when you want to ask and say the time on the clock, like you just looked at the clock, you might ask, ¿Qué hora es? What time is it? If the clock looked like that, you would say, es la una, it's 1 o'clock, es la una. Or for this clock, you would say, son las dos, it's 2 o'clock. That's if you're looking at a clock to find out what time it is at the moment. But you also need to know how to ask and say at what time an event occurs. In this case, you're probably looking at an agenda or a schedule. To ask that question, you might say, ¿A qué hora es el almuerzo? Es a la 1:30. In Spanish, to ask at what time something happens, you use the word a. A is the word for at in Spanish. So you ask, ¿A qué hora es? And es a la 1. In this case, lunch is at 1:30. Here's another example. ¿A qué hora es el concierto? Es a las 8:15. Did you notice that we changed a la to a las? Because in the first example, it was 1:30 a la 1:30. And now it's 8 a las 8:15. To ask and say at what time an event begins, you would use a qué hora empieza. Empieza is the word for begins. A qué hora empieza la escuela. Empieza, it begins, a las 9. Empieza a las 9. La escuela empieza a las 9. If you want to ask and say at what time an event ends, you will use the word termina. ¿A qué hora termina la escuela? La escuela termina a las 4:15. 4:15. Termina sounds like the word in English terminate. So now let's look at a schedule, and let me give you a little bit more vocabulary on the schedule. Horario is the word for schedule. That would make sense in this context. El periodo is the word for period. And if you notice, the way that Spanish indicates things like first, second, third is to have an O with a line underneath it. That is the typical way that Spanish would say first, second, third. And this is el periodo. The next column is hora. That's the word for time, or looks like our word hour, hora. And then finally, in the last column, you have the word la clase. La clase, which is the word for class, also academy. Okay, so now let's ask and answer some questions about this schedule. ¿A qué hora es la clase de literatura? Well, if you look at the schedule, you can see that la literatura es a las 2:24. How about this one? ¿A qué hora es la clase de ciencias? Look at the schedule. Ciencias. Es a las 10:02. 9:58. You could also say a las 9:58. ¿A qué hora es la clase de arte? La clase de arte es a las 11:02. 11:02. ¿A qué hora empieza el almuerzo? Empieza el almuerzo. El almuerzo empieza a la 1:10. We're talking about when it begins, and most of the time on the schedule, we've just referred to the beginning time of something. In this case, a la una, remember it's 1, so you have to say a la 1:10. ¿A qué hora termina la clase de álgebra? Now we're asking what time it ends. Termina. La clase de álgebra termina a las 4:15. Do you notice how close in spelling and pronunciation those two words are? Cuatro, cuarto. The first one is 4, and the second one is a fourth or a quarter. 4:15, because 15 after is a quarter of an hour. Termina a las 4:15. So let's do a quick review. The question is, ¿a qué hora es? That's to ask at what time an event occurs on a schedule or an agenda. ¿A qué hora es? And the answer is going to start with es a. You will use la if it's una. You will use las if it's dos or bigger. So la for 1 and las for 2 or any number bigger on the clock. To say what time something begins or ask, you would say, ¿a qué hora empieza? ¿A qué hora empieza? At what time does the class, for example, start? ¿A qué hora empieza? And to ask what time something ends, ¿a qué hora termina? ¿A qué hora termina? Make sure that you have these in your notes because your next quiz will cover this information as well. So your vocabulary quiz will cover the subjects and the bigger numbers and ordinal numbers, and also asking and answering questions about a schedule. Adios.